Good evening, everyone. And on behalf of Charles Dickens, the Larchmont Public Library, and your friendly local librarian, Frank Connelly, welcome. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight I am to have the pleasure of reading to you A Christmas Carol, being a ghost story of Christmas in 4 staves. Stave 1, Marley's Ghost. Marley was dead to begin with. There is no doubt whatever about that. The register of his burial was signed by the clergyman, the clerk, the undertaker, and the chief mourner. Scrooge signed it, and Scrooge's name was good upon the exchange for anything he chose to put his hand to. Old Marley was as dead as a doornail. Mind, I don't mean to say that I know of my own knowledge what there is particularly dead about a doornail. I might have been inclined myself to regard a coffin nail as the deadliest piece of ironmongery in the trade. But the wisdom of our ancestors is in the simile, and my unhallowed hands shall not disturb it, or the country's done for. You will therefore permit me to repeat emphatically that Marley was as dead as a doornail. Scrooge knew he was dead. Of course he did. How could it be otherwise? Scrooge and he were partners for I don't know how many years. Scrooge was his sole executor, his sole administrator, his sole assign, his sole residuary legatee, his sole friend, his sole mourner. Scrooge never did paint out Marley's name, however. There it yet stood, years afterwards, above the warehouse door. Scrooge and Marley. The firm was known as Scrooge and Marley. Sometimes people in the news of the business called Scrooge Scrooge, and sometimes Marley. He answered to both names. It was all the same to him. Oh, but he was a tight-fisted hand at the grindstone, was Scrooge. A squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner. Cold, self-contained, and solitary as an oyster. People never stopped him in the street to say with gladsome looks, "My dear Scrooge, how are you? When will you come to see me?" No beggars implored him to bestow a trifle. No children asked him what it was o'clock. No man or woman ever once in his entire life inquired the way to such and such a place of Scrooge. Even the blind men's dogs appeared to know him, and when they saw him coming on, would tug their owners into doorways and up courts. But what did Scrooge care? It was the very thing he liked, to edge his way along the crowded paths of life, warning all human sympathy to keep its distance. Once upon a time, of all the good days in the year, upon a Christmas Eve, old Scrooge sat busy in his counting house. It was cold, bleak, biting, foggy weather, and the city clerks had just only gone 3, but it was quite dark already. The door of Scrooge's counting house was open, that he might keep his eye upon his clerk, who, in a dismal little cell beyond, sort of a tank, was copying letters. Scrooge had a very small fire, but the clerk's fire was so much smaller that it appeared to be 1 coal. But he couldn't replenish it, for Scrooge kept the coal box in his own room. And so surely as the clerk came in with the shovel, the master predicted it would be necessary for them to part. Wherefore the clerk put on his white comforter and tried to warm himself at the candle, in which effort, not being a man of strong imagination, he decidedly failed. "A Merry Christmas, Uncle! God save you!" cried a cheery voice. It was the voice of Scrooge's nephew, who came upon him so quickly that this was the first intimation Scrooge had of his approach. "Ah," said Scrooge. "Humbug! Christmas a humbug, Uncle? You don't mean that, I'm sure." "I do. Out upon Merry Christmas. What's Christmas time to you but a time for paying bills without money? A time for finding yourself a year older and not an hour richer. A time for balancing your books and having every item in them through a round dozen of months presented dead against you. If I had my will, every idiot who goes about with Merry Christmas on his lips should be boiled with his own pudding and buried with a stick of holly through his heart. He should. Uncle, nephew, keep Christmas in your way and let me keep it in mine. Keep it, but you don't keep it. Let me leave it alone then. Much good it may do you. Much good it's ever done you. There are many things from which I might have derived good, by which I have not profited, I dare say. Christmas among the rest. But I am sure that I've always thought of Christmas time, when it comes around again, as a good time, a kind, forgiving, charitable, pleasant time. The only time I know of in the long calendar of the year when men and women seem, by one consent, to open their shut-up hearts freely and think of people below them as if they were really fellow travelers to the grave and not another race of creatures bound on other journeys. Therefore, Uncle, though it has never put a scrap of gold or silver in my pocket, I believe it has done me good and will do me good. And I say, God bless it. The clerk in the tank involuntarily applauded. Let me hear another sound from you, said Scrooge, and you'll keep your Christmas by losing your situation. You're quite the powerful speaker, sir, he added, turning to his nephew. I wonder you don't go into Parliament. Don't be angry, Uncle. Come, dine with us tomorrow. Scrooge said he would see him. Oh, yes, indeed he did. He went the full length of the expression, and he would see him in that extremity first. But why? Cried Scrooge's nephew. Why? Why did you get married? Because I fell in love. Because you fell in love, growled Scrooge, as if that were the only thing in the whole world that more ridiculous than a Merry Christmas. Good afternoon. Hey, Uncle, but you never came to see me before that happened. Why give it as a reason for not coming now? Good afternoon. I want nothing from you. I ask nothing of you. Why cannot we be friends? Good afternoon. I'm sorry with all my heart to find you so resolute. We've never had any quarrel to which I've been a party, but I've made the trial in homage to Christmas, and I'll keep my Christmas humor to the last. So, a Merry Christmas, Uncle. Good afternoon, and a Happy New Year. His nephew left without an angry word, notwithstanding. The clerk, in letting Scrooge's nephew out, had let two other people in. They were portly gentlemen, pleasant to behold, and now stood with their hats off in Scrooge's office. They had books and papers in their hands and bowed to him. Scrooge and Marley's, said one of the gentlemen, referring to his list. Have I the pleasure of addressing Mr. Scrooge or Mr. Marley? Mr. Marley has been dead these 7 years. He died 7 years ago this very night. At this festive season of the year, Mr. Scrooge, said the gentleman, taking up a pen, it is more than usually desirable that we should make some slight provision for the poor and destitute, who suffer greatly at the present time. Many thousands are in want of common necessities. Hundreds of thousands are in want of common comfort, sir. Are there no prisons? Plenty of prisons, said the gentleman, laying the pen down. And the union workhouses, are they still in operation? And the treadmill and the poor law are in full vigor then? They are still. I wish I could say they were not. Oh, I was afraid from what you'd said at first that something had happened to stop them in their useful course. I'm very glad to hear it. Under the impression that they scarcely furnish Christian cheer of mind or body to the unoffending multitude, A few of us are endeavoring to raise a fund to buy the poor some meat and drink and means of warmth. We choose this time because it is a time of all others when want is keenly felt and abundance rejoices. What shall I put you down for? Nothing. You wish to be anonymous. I wish to be left alone. Since you asked me what I wish, gentlemen, that is my answer. I don't make merry myself at Christmas, and I can't afford to make idle people merry. I help to support the prisons and the workhouses, and they cost enough, and those who are badly off must go there. Many can't go there, and many would rather die. If they would rather die, they'd better do it and decrease the surplus population. Seeing clearly it would be useless to pursue their point, the gentleman withdrew. Scrooge resumed his labors with an improved opinion of himself. At length, the hour of shutting up the counting house arrived. With an ill will, Scrooge, dismounting from his stool, tacitly admitted the fact to the expectant clerk in the tank, who instantly stuffed his candle out and put on his hat. "You want all day tomorrow, I suppose?" "If quite convenient, sir." "It's not convenient, it's not fair. If I was to stop half a crown for it, you'd think yourself mightily ill-used, I'll be bound." "Yes, sir." "And you don't think me ill-used when I pay a day's wages for no work." "It's only once a year, sir." "Poor excuse for picking a man's pocket every 25th of December. But I suppose you must have the whole day. Be here all the earlier next morning." The clerk promised that he would, and Scrooge walked out with a growl, buttoning his greatcoat to the chin. The office was closed in a twinkling, and the clerk, with the long ends of his white comforter dangling below his waist, for he boasted no greatcoat, went down a slide at the end of a lane of boys 20 times in honor of it being Christmas Eve, and then ran home as hard as he could pelt to play at blind man's buff. Scrooge took his melancholy dinner in his usual melancholy tavern, and having read all the newspapers and beguiled the rest of the evening with his banker's book, went home to bed. He lived in chambers that had once belonged to his deceased partner. They were a gloomy suite of rooms in a lowering pile of a building up a yard. The building was old enough now and dreary enough, for nobody lived in it but Scrooge, the other rooms all being let out as offices. Now, it is a fact that there was nothing at all particular about the knocker on the door of this house, except that it was very large. Also, that Scrooge had seen it night and morning during his whole residence in that place. Also, that Scrooge had as little of what is called fancy or imagination about him as any man in the city of London. And yet Scrooge, having his key in the lock of the door, saw in the knocker, without its undergoing any intermediate process of change, not a knocker, but Marley's face. Marley's face, with dismal light about it, like a bad lobster in a dark cellar. It was not angry or ferocious, but looked at Scrooge as Marley used to look, with ghostly spectacles turned up on its ghostly forehead. As Scrooge looked fixedly at this phenomenon, it was a knocker again. He said, "Pooh, pooh," and closed that door with a bang. The sound resounded through the house like thunder. Every room above and every cask in the wine merchant's cellars below seemed to have a separate peal of echoes of its own. Scrooge was not a man to be frightened by echoes. He fastened the door and walked across the hall and up the stairs, slowly too, trimming his candle as he went. Up Scrooge went, not caring a button for its being very dark. Darkness is cheap, and Scrooge liked it. But before he shut his heavy door, He walked through his rooms to see that all was right. He had just enough recollection of the face to desire to do that. Sitting room, lumber room, bedroom, all as they should be. Nobody under the table. Nobody under the sofa. Small fire in the grate. Spoon and basin ready with a little saucepan of gruel. Scrooge had a cold in his head upon the hob. Nobody under the bed. Nobody in the closet. Nobody in his dressing gown, which was hanging up in a suspicious angle against the wall. Lumber room as usual. Quite satisfied, he closed his door and locked himself in. Double locked himself in, which was not his custom. Thus secured against surprise, he took off his cravat, put on his dressing gown and slippers and his nightcap, and sat down before the very low fire to take his gruel. As he threw his head back in the chair, his glance happened to rest upon a bell, an unused bell that had hung in the room and communicated, for some purpose now forgotten, with a chamber in the highest story of the building. It was with great astonishment and strange, inexplicable dread that, as he looked, he saw this bell begin to swing. Soon it rang out loudly, and so did every bell in the house. This was succeeded by a clanking noise deep down below, as if some person were dragging a heavy chain over the casks in the wine merchant's cellar. Then he heard the noise much louder on the floors below. Then, coming up the stairs, coming straight towards his door. It's humbug still. I won't believe it. It came on through the heavy door, and a specter passed into the room before his eyes. Upon its coming in, the dying flame leaped up as though it cried, I know him, Marley's ghost. The same face, the very same. Marley in his pigtail, usual waistcoat, tights, and boots. The chain he drew was clasped around his middle. It was long and wound about him, and was made of cash boxes, keys, padlocks, ledgers, deeds, and heavy purses wrought in steel. His body was transparent, so that Scrooge, observing him and looking through his waistcoat, could see the two buttons on his coat behind. Marley had often heard it said that Scrooge had often heard it said that Marley had no heart, but he had never believed it until now. No, nor did he believe it even now. Though he looked the phantom through and through and saw it standing before him, though he felt the chilling influence of the deaf cold eyes and noticed the very texture of the folded kerchief bound around its head and chin, he was still incredulous. How now, said Scrooge, caustic and cold as ever. What do you want with me? Much. Marley's voice, no doubt about it. Who are you? Ask me who I was. Who were you then? In life, I was your partner, Jacob Marley. Can you sit down? I can. Do it then. Scrooge asked the question because he didn't know whether a ghost so transparent might find himself in a condition to take a chair, and felt that in the event of its being impossible, it might involve the necessity of an embarrassing explanation. But the ghost sat down on the opposite side of the fireplace as if he were quite used to it. You don't believe in me. I don't. What evidence would you have of my reality beyond that of your senses? I don't know. Why do you doubt your senses? Because a little thing affects them. A slight disorder of the stomach makes them cheats. You may be an undigested bit of beef, a pot of mustard, crumb of cheese, a fragment from an underdone potato. There's more of gravy than of grave about you, whatever you are. Scrooge was not much in the habit of cracking jokes, nor did he feel in his heart by any means waggish then. But the truth is, he tried to be smart as a way of distracting his own attention and keeping down his horror. But how much greater was his horror when the phantom, taking off the bandage around its head as if it were too warm to wear indoors, its jaw dropped down upon its breast. Man of the worldly mind, do you believe in me or not? Mercy, dreadful, dreadful apparition. Why do you trouble me? Why do spirits walk the earth? And why do they come to me? It is required of every man that the spirit within him should walk abroad among his fellow men and travel far and wide. If that spirit does not go forth in life, it is condemned to do so after death. It is doomed to wander through the world and witness what it cannot share, what it might have shared in life, and have turned to happiness. I cannot rest. I cannot stay. I cannot linger anywhere. My spirit never walked beyond our counting house. Mark me. In life, my spirit never roved beyond the narrow limits of our muddy changing whole. And many journeys lie before me. But you're always a good man of business, Jacob, faltered Scrooge, who now began to apply this to himself. Business, cried the ghost, wringing its hands. Mankind was my business. The common welfare was my business. Charity, mercy, forbearance, benevolence were all my business. The dealings of my trade were but a drop of water in the comprehensive ocean of my business. Scrooge was very much dismayed to hear the specter going on at this rate and began to quake exceedingly. You're fettered. Tell me why. I wear this chain I forged in life. I made it link by link and yard by yard. I girded it on of my own free will, and of my own free will I wore it. Is its pattern strange to you? Or would you know the weight and length of the strong coil you bear yourself? It was as heavy and as long as this 7 Christmas Eves ago. You have labored on it since. It is a ponderous chain. Scrooge glanced about him on the floor in the expectation of finding himself surrounded by some 50 or 60 fathoms of iron cable, but he could see nothing. Hear me. My time is nearly gone. I will, but don't be hard on me. Don't be flowery, Jacob, pray. I'm here to warn you tonight that you have yet a chance and hope of escaping my fate, a chance and hope of my procuring Ebenezer. You're always a good friend to me. Thank you, Jacob. You will be haunted by 3 spirits. Is that the chance and hope you mentioned, Jacob? I think I'd rather not. Without their visits, you cannot hope to shun the path I tread. Expect the first tomorrow night when the bell tolls 1. Expect the second on the second night at the same hour. The third on the next night when the last stroke of 12 has ceased to vibrate. Look to see me no more, and look that, for your own sake, you will remember what has passed between us. It walked backward from him, and with every step it took, the window raised itself a little, so that when the apparition reached it, it was wide open. And the ghost of Jacob Marley floated out through the self-opened window into the bleak, dark night. Scrooge closed the window and examined the door by which the ghost had entered. It was double locked, as he had locked it with his own hands, and the bolts were undisturbed. Scrooge tried to say humbug, but stopped at the first syllable. And being, from the emotion he had undergone and the fatigues of the day, or his glimpse of the invisible world, or the dull conversation of the ghost, much in need of repose, he went straight to bed without undressing and fell asleep upon the instant. Stave 2, the first of the three spirits. When Scrooge awoke, it was so dark that, looking out of bed, he could scarcely distinguish between the transparent window from the opaque walls of his chamber, when suddenly the church clock tolled a deep, dull, hollow, melancholy 1. Light flashed up in the room upon the instant, and the curtains of his bed were drawn aside by a strange figure, like a child, yet not so like a child as like an old man, viewed through some supernatural medium that gave him the appearance of having receded from the view and being diminished to a child's proportions. Its hair, which hung about its neck and down its back, was white, as if with age, and yet the face had not a wrinkle upon it, and the tenderest bloom was on the skin. It held a branch of fresh green holly in its hand, and in singular contradiction of that wintry emblem, had its dress trimmed with summer flowers. But the strangest thing about it was that from the crown of its head there sprung a clear, bright jet of light by which all this was visible. "Are you the spirit, sir, whose coming was foretold me?" "I am." "Who and what are you?" "I am the ghost of Christmas past." "Long past?" "No, your past. The things that you will see with me are the shadows of the things that have been. They will have no consciousness of us." Scrooge then made bold to inquire what business brought him there. "Your welfare. Rise and walk with me." It would have been in vain for Scrooge to plead that the weather and the hour were not adapted to pedestrian purposes, that the bed was warm, the thermometer was a long way below freezing, and that he was clad but lightly in his slippers, dressing gown, and nightcap, and they had a cold upon him at the time. The grasp, gentle as a woman's hand, was not to be resisted. But he rose, but finding that the spirit made towards the window, he clasped its robe in supplication. "I am a mortal, and liable to fall. Bear but a touch of my hand." "There," said the spirit, laying it upon his heart, "you shall be upheld in more than this." As the words were spoken, they passed through the wall and stood in the busy thoroughfares of a city. It was made plain enough by the dressing of the shops that here, too, it was Christmas time. The ghost stopped at a certain warehouse door and asked Scrooge if he knew it. "Know it? Was I apprenticed here?" They went in. At the sight of an old man in a Welsh wig, sitting behind such a high desk that if he had been 2 inches tall, he must have knocked his head against the ceiling, Scrooge cried out in great excitement, Why, it's old Fezziwig! Bless his heart, it's Fezziwig alive again!" Old Fezziwig laid down his pen, looked up at the clock, which pointed to the hour of 7, rubbed his hands, adjusted his capacious waistcoat, laughed all over himself from his shoes to his organ of benevolence, and called out in a comfortable, oily, fat, rich, jovial voice, "Yo-ho there, Ebenezer, Dick!" The moving picture of Scrooge's former self as a young man came briskly in, accompanied by his fellow apprentice. "Dick Wilkins, to be sure," said Scrooge to the ghost. "My old fellow apprentice, bless me, yes, there he is." "Yo-ho, my boys," said Fezziwig, "no more work tonight. Christmas Eve, Dick. Christmas, Ebenezer. Let's have the shutters up before a man can say Jack Robinson. Clear away, my lads, and let's have lots of room here. Clear away. There was nothing they wouldn't have cleared away or couldn't have cleared away with old Fezziwig looking on. It was done in a moment. Every movable was packed off as if it were dismissed from public life forever. The floor was swept and watered, the lamps trimmed, fuel was heaped upon the fire, and the warehouse was as warm and snug and dry and bright a ballroom as you would desire to see upon a winter's night. In came a fiddler with a music book and went up to the lofty desk and made an orchestra of it and tuned like 50 stomach aches. In came Mrs. Fezziwig, one vast substantial smile. In came the three Miss Fezziwigs, beaming and lovable. In came the 6 young followers whose hearts they broke. In came all the young men and women employed in the business. In came the housemaid and with her cousin the baker. In came the cook with her brother's particular friend the milkman. In they all came, one after another, some shyly, some boldly, some gracefully, some awkwardly, some pushing, some pulling. In they all came anyhow and everyhow. Away they all went, 20 couples at once, hands half around and back again the other way, down the middle and up again. Round and round in various stages of affectionate grouping. Old top couple, always turning up in the wrong place. The new top couple starting off again as soon as they got there. All top couples at last, and not a bottom one to help them. When this result was brought about, old Fezziwig, clapping his hands to stop the dance, cried out, "Well done!" And the fiddler plunged his hot face into a pot of porter, especially provided for the purpose. There were more dances, and there were forfeits, and more dances, and there was cake, and there was negus. There was a great piece of cold roast, a great piece of cold boiled, and there were mince pies, and plenty of beer. But the great effect of the evening came after the roast and the boiled, when the fiddler struck up Sir Roger de Coverley. Then old Fezziwig stood out to dance with Mrs. Fezziwig, top couple too, with a good stiff piece of work cut out for them. 3 or 4 and 20 pairs of partners, people who were not to be trifled with, people who would dance and had no notion of walking. But if it had been twice as many, 4 times, old Fezziwig would have been a match for them, and so would Mrs. Fezziwig. As to her, she was worthy to be his partner in every sense of the term. And if that's not high praise, let me know higher than I might use it. A positive light seems to issue from Fezziwig's calves. They shone in every part of the dance. You could have predicted at any given time what would become of them next. And when old Fezziwig and Mrs. Fezziwig had gone through all the dance, advance and retire, turn your partner, bow and curtsy, corkscrew, thread the needle, and back again to your place, Fezziwig cut so deftly that he appeared to wink with his legs. When the clock struck 11, this domestic ball broke up. Mr. and Mrs. Fezziwig took their stations, went on either side of the door, and shaking hands with every person individually as he or she went out, wished him or her a Merry Christmas. When everybody had retired but the 2 apprentices, they did the same to them, and thus the cheerful voices died away. During the whole of this time, Scrooge had acted like a man out of his wits. His heart and soul were in the scene, and with his former self. He corroborated everything, remembered everything, enjoyed everything, and underwent the strangest agitation. "Small matter," said the ghost, "to make these silly folks so full of gratitude. You spent but a few pounds of your mortal money, 3 or 4 perhaps. Is that so much that he deserves this praise?" "It isn't that," said Scrooge. It isn't that, Spirit. He has the power to make us happy or unhappy, to make our service light or burdensome, a pleasure or a toil. Say that his power lies in words and looks, in things so slight and insignificant it's impossible to add and count them up. What then? The happiness he gives is quite as great as if it cost a fortune. He felt the Spirit's glance and stopped. What's the matter? Nothing particular. Something, I think. No, I should like to be able to say a word or two to my clerk just now. That's all. My time grows short, observed the Spirit. Quick. This was not addressed to Scrooge or to anyone whom he could see, but it produced an immediate effect. For again, he saw himself. He was older now, a man in the prime of life. He was not alone, but sat by the side of a fair young girl in a black mourning dress, in whose eyes there were tears. It matters little, she said softly to Scrooge's former self. To you, very little. Another idol has displaced me. And if it can comfort you in time to come, as I would have tried to do, I have no just cause to grieve. What idol has displaced you? A golden one. You fear the world too much. I have seen your nobler aspirations fall off one by one until the master passion, gain, engrosses you. Have I not? What then? Even if I've grown so much wiser, what then? I have not changed towards you. Have I ever sought release from our engagement? In words, no, never. In what then? In a changed nature, in an altered spirit, in another atmosphere of life. Another hope as its great end. If you were free today, tomorrow, or yesterday, can even I believe that you would choose a dowerless girl, or choosing her? Do I not know that your repentance and regret would surely follow? I do. And I release you with a full heart for the love of him you once were. Spirit, remove me from this place. I told you these were the shadows of things that have been. They are what they are. Do not blame me. Remove me. I cannot bear it. Take me, leave me, take me back. Haunt me no longer. As he struggled with the Spirit, he was conscious of being exhausted and overcome by an irresistible drowsiness, and further, of being in his own bedroom. He had barely time to reel to bed before he sank into a heavy sleep. Stave 3, the second of 3 spirits. Scrooge awoke in his bedroom. There was no doubt about that, but it and his adjoining sitting room, into which he shuffled in his slippers, attracted by a great light there, had undergone a surprising transformation. The walls and ceiling were so hung with living green that it looked a perfect grove. The leaves of holly, mistletoe, and ivy reflected back the light as if so many little mirrors had been scattered there. And such a mighty blaze went roaring up the chimney as that petrifaction of a hearth had never known in Scrooge's time, or Marley's, or for many and many a winter season gone. Heaped upon the floor to form a kind of throne with turkeys, geese, game, brawn, great joints of meat, suckling pigs, long wreaths of sausages, mince pies, plum puddings, barrels of oysters, red-hot chestnuts, cherry-cheeked apples, juicy oranges, luscious pears, immense 12th cakes, and great bowls of punch, which made the chamber dim with their delicious steam. In easy state upon this couch, there sat a giant, glorious to see, who bore a glowing torch in shape not unlike Plenty's horn, and who raised it high to shed its light on Scrooge as he came peeping round the door. Come in and know me better, man, I am the ghost of Christmas present. Look upon me. You have never seen the likes of me before? Never. I've never walked forth with the younger members of my family, meaning, for I am very young, my elder brothers born in these late years? I don't think I have. I'm afraid I have not. Have you had many brothers, Spirit? More than 1,800. A tremendous family to provide for. Spirit, conduct me where you will. I went forth last night on compulsion, and I learned a lesson which is working now. Tonight, if you have aught to teach me, let me profit by it. Touch my robe. Scrooge did as he was told and held it fast. The room and the contents all vanished instantly, and they stood in the city streets upon a snowy Christmas morning. Scrooge and the ghost passed on, invisible to Scrooge's clerks. And on the threshold of the door, the spirit smiled and stopped to bless Bob Cratchit's dwelling with the sprinklings of his torch. Now think of that. Bob had but 15 bob a week himself. He pocketed on Saturdays but 15 copies of his Christian name, and yet the ghost of Christmas present blessed his 4-room house. Then up rose Mrs. Cratchit, Cratchit's wife, dressed out but poorly in a twice-turned gown, brave with ribbons or cheap and make a goodly show for 6pence. And she laid the cloth, assisted by Belinda Cratchit, second of her daughters, also brave in ribbons, while Master Peter Cratchit plunged a fork into the saucepan of potatoes. And now 2 smaller Cratchits, boy and girl, came tearing in, screaming that outside the baker's they had smelt the goose and known it for their own, and basking in luxurious thoughts of sage and onions, exalted Master Peter to the skies, while he blew the fire until the slow potatoes bubbling up knocked loudly the saucepan lid to be let out and peeled. What has ever got your precious father, then? Said Mrs. Cratchit, and your brother Tiny Tim. Martha wanted us have his late last Christmas day is half an hour. Here's Martha, mother, cried the girl, appearing as she spoke. Here's Martha, mother, cried the 2 young Cratchits. Hurrah! There's such a goose, Martha. Why, bless your heart alive, my dear. How late you are. We had a great deal of work to finish up last night, replied the girl, and had to clear away this morning, mother. Well, never mind, as long as you come. Sit you down before the fire, my dear, and have a warble. Lord bless you. No, there's father coming, cried the 2 young Cratchits, who were everywhere at once. Hide, Martha, hide. So Martha hid herself, and in came Bob, the father, with at least 3 feet of comforter, exclusive of the fringe, hanging down before him. And his threadbare clothes were darned up and brushed to look seasonable, and Tiny Tim on his shoulder. Alas for Tiny Tim, he bore a little crutch and had his limbs supported by an iron frame. Why, where's our Martha? cried Bob Cratchit, looking round. Not coming, said Mrs. Cratchit. Not coming upon Christmas Day? Martha didn't like to see him disappointed, if it only were in joke. So she came out from behind the closet door and ran to his arms, while the 2 young Cratchits hustled Tiny Tim and bore him off to the wash house, where he might hear the pudding singing in the copper. And how did little Tim behave? Good as gold, said Bob and Brother. Somehow he gets fault, though, sitting by himself so much, and thinks the strangest things you ever heard. He told me coming home that he hoped people saw him in church because he was a cripple, and it might be pleasant for them to remember on Christmas Day who made lame beggars walk and blind men see. Bob said that Tiny Tim was growing strong and hearty. His active little crutch was heard upon the floor, and back came Tiny Tim before another word was spoken, escorted by his brother and sister to his stool beside the fire, while Bob turning up his cuffs, as if, poor fellow, they were capable of being made more shabby, compounded some hot mixture with gin and lemons, stirred it round and round, and put it on the hob to simmer. Master Peter and the two ubiquitous young Cratchits went to fetch the goose, with which they soon returned in high procession. Mrs. Cratchit made the gravy, hissing hot. Master Peter mashed the potatoes with incredible vigor. Miss Belinda sweetened up the applesauce. Martha dusted the hot plates. Bob took Tiny Tim beside him to a corner at the table, and the two young Cratchits set chairs for everybody, not forgetting themselves, and mounting guard upon their posts, crammed spoons in their mouths, lest they should shriek for goose before their turn came to be helped. At last, the dishes were laid on, and grace was said. It was succeeded by a breathless pause, as Mrs. Cratchit, looking slowly all along the carving knife, prepared to plunge it into the breast. But when she did, and when the long-expected gush of stuffing issued forth, one murmur of delight arose all around the table. And even Tiny Tim, excited by the two young Cratchits, beat on the table with the head of his knife and feebly cried, "Hurrah!" There never was such a goose. Bob said he didn't believe there was ever such a goose cooked. Its tenderness, flavor, size, and cheapness were themes of universal admiration. Eked out by applesauce and mashed potatoes, it was a sufficient dinner for the whole family. Indeed, as Mrs. Cratchit said with great delight, surveying one small atom of bone upon the dish, they hadn't eaten it all at last. Yet everyone had had enough, and the youngest Cratchits in particular were steeped in sage and onions to the eyebrows. But now, the plates being changed by Miss Belinda, Mrs. Cratchit left the room alone, too nervous to bear witness, to take the pudding up and bring it in. Suppose it should not be done enough. Suppose it should break in turning out. Suppose somebody should have got over the wall of the backyard and stolen it while they were making merry with the goose. A supposition at which the two young Cratchits became livid. All sorts of horrors were supposed. Hello, great deal of steam. The pudding was out of the copper. Smell like washing day. That was the cloth. Smell like an eating house and a pastry cook's next door to each other and a laundress's next door to that. That was the pudding. In half a minute, Mrs. Cratchit entered, flushed but smiling proudly with the pudding, like a speckled cannonball, so hard and firm, blazing with half of a quarter pint of ignited brandy, and bedight with Christmas holly stuck into the top. Oh, a wonderful pudding. Bob Cratchit said, and calmly too, that he regarded it as the greatest success achieved by Mrs. Cratchit since their marriage. Mrs. Cratchit said that now the weight was off her mind, she could confess that she had her doubts about the quantity of flour. Everybody had something to say about it, but nobody said or thought that it was at all a small pudding for a large family. Any Cratchit would have blushed to hint at such a thing. At last, the dinner was all done, the cloth was cleared, the hearth swept, and the fire made up. The compound in the jug being tasted and considered perfect. Apples and oranges were put upon the table, and a shovelful of chestnuts on the fire. Then all the Cratchit family drew around the hearth in what Bob called a circle. And at Bob's elbow stood the family display of glass, 2 tumblers and a custard cup without a handle. These held the hot stuff from the jug, however, as well as golden goblets would have done. And Bob served it out with beaming looks, while the chestnuts on the fire sputtered and crackled noisily. And Bob proposed, "A Merry Christmas to us all, my dears. God bless us," which all the family re-echoed. "God bless us, everyone," said Tiny Tim, last of all. He sat very close to his father's side upon his little stool. Bob held his withered little hand in his, as if he loved the child, and wished to keep him by his side, and dreaded that he might be taken from him. "Spirit," said Scrooge, with an interest he had never felt before, "tell me if Tiny Tim will live. I see a vacant seat in the porch in the corner, with a crutch without an owner, carefully preserved. If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, the child will die." "No, no," said Scrooge. "Oh, no, kind spirit. Say he will be spared." "If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, none other of my race will find him here." "What then? If he be like to die, he'd better do it, and decrease the surplus population." Scrooge hung his head to hear his own words quoted by the spirit, and was overcome with grief. "Man, if man you be at heart, not adamant, forbear that wicked cant until you have discovered what the surplus is and where it is. Will you decide what men will live and what men will die? It may be, in the sight of heaven, you are more worthless and less fit to live than millions like this poor man's child." Scrooge raised his head speedily on hearing his own name. "Mr. Scrooge," said Bob. "I'll give you Mr. Scrooge, the founder of the feast." "Founder of the feast, indeed!" cried Mrs. Cratchit. "I wish I had him here. I'd give him a good piece of my mind to feast on, and I hope he'd have a good appetite for it." "My dear," said Bob, "the children. Christmas Day. It should be Christmas Day, I'm sure, on which one drinks the health of such an odious, stingy, unfeeling man as Scrooge. You know he is, Robert. Nobody knows it better than you poor fellow." "My dear, Christmas Day. I'll drink his health for your sake in the days, but not for his. Long life to him, Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. He'll be very happy and very merry, I have no doubt." The children drank the toast after her. It was the first of their proceedings, and it had no heartiness in it. Scrooge was the ogre of the family. The mention of his name cast a dark shadow on the party, which was not dispelled for full 5 minutes. After it had passed away, they were 10 times merrier than before, from the mere relief of Scrooge the Baleful being done with. And then the chestnuts in the jug went round and round, and by and by they had a song about a lost child traveling in the snow from Tiny Tim, who had a plaintive little voice and sang it very well indeed. There was nothing of high mark in this. They were not a handsome family. They were not well dressed. Their shoes were far from being waterproof. Their clothes were scanty, and Peter might have known, and very likely did, the inside of a pawnbroker's shop. But they were happy, grateful, pleased with one another, and contented with the time. And when they faded, and looked happier yet at the bright sprinklings of the spirit's torch at parting, Scrooge had his eye upon them, especially upon Tiny Tim, until the last. It was a great surprise to Scrooge, as the scene vanished, to hear a hearty laugh. It was a much greater surprise to recognize it as his own nephew's, and to find himself in a bright, dry, gleaming room with the spirit standing smiling by his side, looking on at that same nephew. He said that Christmas was a humbug as I lived. He believed it too. More shame for him, Fred, said Scrooge's niece indignantly. Bless these women, they never do anything by halves. They are always in earnest. He's a comical old fellow, that's the truth, but not so pleasant as he might be. However, his offenses carry their own punishment. And I have nothing to say against him. Who suffers by his ill whims? Himself, always. Here he takes it into his head to dislike us, and he won't come to dinner. What's the consequence? He doesn't lose much of a dinner. Indeed, I think he loses a very good dinner, said Scrooge's niece. Everybody else said the same, and they must be allowed to have been good, competent judges, because they just had dinner, and with the dessert upon the table, were clustered around the fire by lamplight. Well, I'm very glad to hear it, said Fred, because I have any great faith in these young housekeepers. What do you say, Topper? Topper clearly had his eye on one of Scrooge's niece's sisters, for he answered that a bachelor was a wretched outcast and had no right to express an opinion on the subject. Whereat Scrooge's niece's sister, the plump one in the lace tucker, and not the one with the roses, blushed. After tea, they had some music, for they were a musical family and knew what they were about. And they could sing a glee or a catch beautifully, I can assure you, especially Topper, who could growl away in the bass like a good, they never swell the large veins in his forehead or get red in the face over it. But they didn't devote the whole evening to music. After a while, they played at forfeits. For it is good to be children sometimes, and never better than at Christmas. There was first a game of blind man's bluff, though. And I no more believe Topper was really blinded than I believe he had eyes in his boots. Because the way in which he went after that plump sister in the lace tucker was an outrage on the credulity of human nature. Knocking down the fire irons, tumbling over the chairs, bumping into the piano, smothering himself in the curtains. Wherever she went, there went he. He always knew where that plump sister was. He wouldn't catch anybody else, even if you had fallen up against him. And some of them did, and stood there. He would have made a feint of endeavoring to seize you that would have been an affront to your understanding, and instantly have sidled off in the direction of the plump sister. Here's a new game, said Scrooge. 1/2 hour spirit. Only one. It was a game called Yes and No, where Scrooge's nephew had to think of something, and the rest must find out what. He only answering to their questions yes or no, as the case was. The fire of questioning to which he was exposed elicited from him that he was thinking of an animal, a live animal, rather a disagreeable animal, a savage animal, an animal that growled and grunted sometimes, and talked sometimes, and lived in London, and walked about the streets, wasn't made a show of, wasn't led by anybody, didn't live in a menagerie, and was never killed in a market. It was not a horse or an ass or a cow or a bull or a tiger or a dog or a pig or a cat or a bear. At every new question put to him, this nephew burst into a fresh roar of laughter and was so inexpressibly tickled that he was obliged to get up off the sofa and stamp his foot. At last, the plump sister cried out, I found it out. I know who it is, Fred. I know who it is. It said, it's your Uncle Scrooge. And it certainly was. Admiration was the sentiment, though some suggested that the reply to, is it a bear, should have been yes. Uncle Scrooge had imperceptibly become so gay and light of heart that he would have drank a toast to the company and made a speech that they could not hear. But the whole scene passed off in the breath of the last word spoken by his nephew, and he and the spirit were again upon their travels. Much they saw, and far they went. many homes they visited, but always with a happy end. The spirit stood beside sick beds, and they were cheerful. On foreign lands, and they were close to home. By struggling men, and they were patient in their greater hope. By poverty, and it was rich. In almshouse, hospital, and jail, in misery's every refuge, where vain man in his little brief authority had not made fast the door and barred the spirit out, he left his blessing and taught Scrooge his precepts. It was a long night, if it were only a night. But Scrooge had his doubts of this, because the Christmas holidays appeared to be condensed into the space of time they passed together. It was strange, too, that while Scrooge remained unaltered in his outward form, the ghost grew older, clearly older. Scrooge had observed this change, but never spoke of it until they left a children's 12th night party, when, looking at the spirit as they stood together in an open space, he noticed that its hair was gray. Are spirits' lives so short? My life upon this globe is very brief. It ends tonight. Tonight? Tonight at midnight. Hark, the time is drawing near. The chimes were ringing the 11:15 at that moment. Forgive me if I am not justified in what I ask, said Scrooge, looking intently at the spirit's robe, but I see something strange and not belonging to yourself protruding from your skirts. Is it a foot or a claw? It might be a claw for the flesh there is upon it, was the spirit's sorrowful reply. Look here. From the foldings of its robe, it brought two children, wretched, abject, frightful, hideous, miserable. They knelt down at his feet and clung to the outside of his garment. Oh man, look here, look down here. They were a boy and a girl, yellow, meager, ragged, scowling, wolfish, but prostate too, in their humility. Where a graceful youth should have filled their features out and touched them with its freshest tints, a pale and shriveled hand like that of age had pinched and twisted them and pulled them into shreds. Where angels might have sat enthroned, devils lurked and glared out menacing. No change, no degradation, no perversion of humanity in any grade through all the mysteries of wonderful creation as monsters half so terrible and dread. Spirit, are they yours? Scrooge could say no more. They are man's, said the spirit, looking down upon them. And they cling to me, appealing from their fathers. This boy is ignorance. This girl is want. Beware them both in all of their degree. But most of all, beware this boy. For on his brow, I see that written, which is doom, unless the writing be erased. Deny it, cried the spirit, stretching out its hands towards the city. Slander those who tell it ye. Admit it for your fractious purposes and make it worse and abide the end. Have they no refuge or resource? Cried Scrooge. Are there no prisons? Said the spirit, turning on him for the last time with his own words. Are there no workhouses? The bell struck 12. Scrooge looked about him for the ghost and saw it no more. The last stroke ceased to vibrate. And he remembered the prediction of old Jacob Marley, and lifting up his eyes, beheld a solemn phantom, draped and hooded, coming like a mist along the ground towards him. Stave 4, the last of the spirits. The phantom slowly, gravely, silently approached. When it came near him, Scrooge bent down upon his knee. For in the air through which the spirit moved, it seemed to scatter gloom and mystery. It was shrouded in a deep black garment that concealed its head, its face, its form, and left nothing visible save one outstretched hand. He knew no more, for the spirit neither spoke nor moved. I am in the presence of the ghost of Christmas yet to come. Ghost of the future, I fear you more than any specter I've seen. But as I know your purpose is to do me good, and as I hope to be another man from what I was, I am prepared to bear you company and do it with a thankful heart. Will you not speak to me? It gave him no reply. The hand was pointed straight before them. Lead on, lead on. The night is waning fast, and it is precious time to me. I know. Lead on, spirit. They seemed scarcely to enter the city, or for the city rather seemed to spring up around them. But there they were in the heart of it, in the stock exchange, amongst all the merchants. The spirit stopped beside one little knot of businessmen. Observing the hand which pointed to them, Scrooge advanced to listen to their talk. "No," said a great fat man with a monstrous chin, I don't know much about it either way. I only know he's dead." "Yeah, old Scratch has finally met his end. What did he die of?" inquired another. "God knows. When did he die?" "Last night, I believe." "What's he done with his money?" asked the red-faced gentleman. "Haven't heard," said the man with the large chin. "Left it to his company, perhaps. Doesn't left it to me, that's all I know. Bye." Scrooge was at first inclined to be surprised that the spirit should attach importance to conversation so fairly trivial. But being assured it must have some hidden purpose, he set himself to consider what it was likely to be. It could scarcely be supposed to have any bearing on the death of Jacob, his old partner, for that was the past, and this ghost province was the future. He looked about in that very place for his own image, but another man stood in his accustomed corner, and though the clock pointed to his usual time of day for being there, he saw no likeness of himself among the multitudes that poured in through the porch. It gave him little surprise, however, for he had been revolving in his head a change of life, and he thought and hoped that he saw his newborn resolutions carried out in this. Spirit, I see. The case of this unhappy man might be my own. My life tends that way now. Merciful heavens, what is this? The scene had changed, and now he almost touched a bare, uncurtained bed, on which, beneath a ragged sheet, there lay something covered up, which, though it was dumb, announced itself in awful language. The room was very dark, too dark to be observed with any accuracy, though Scrooge glanced around in obedience to a secret impulse, anxious to know what kind of room it was. Pale light, rising the outer air, fell straight upon this bed, and on it, plundered and bereft, unwatched, unwept, uncared for, was the body of this unknown man. Scrooge thought, if this man could be raised up now, what would be his foremost thoughts? Avarice, hard dealing, griping cares? They brought him to such a rich end, truly. He lay in the dark, empty house, with not a man, a woman, or a child to say, he was kind to me in this or that, and for the memory of one kind word, I will be kind to him. A cat was tearing at the door. and there was a sound of gnawing rats beneath the hearthstone. What they wanted in this room of death, Scrooge dared not dare to think. Spirit, let me see some tenderness in the next room of death, or this dark chamber, spirit, will forever be present to me. The ghost conducted him to poor Bob Cratchit's house and found the mother and children seated around the fire. Quiet, very quiet. The noisy little Cratchits were as still as statues in one corner, looking up at Peter, who had a book before him. The mother and her daughters were engaged in needlework. But surely they were very quiet. The mother laid her work upon the table with her hand to her face. The color hurts my eyes. The color is black. Oh, poor Tiny Tim. They're better now. It makes them weak by candlelight. I would show weak eyes to your father when he comes home for the world. Must be near his time. Past it, rather, Peter answered, shutting up his book. But I think he's walked a little slower than he used these past few evenings, Mother. I've known him to walk with Tiny Tim upon his shoulder very fast indeed. So have I, cried Peter, often. So have I, exclaimed another. So at all. But it was very light to carry, and your father loved him so that there was no trouble. No trouble. There's your father at the door. She hurried out to meet him, and little Bob in his comforter, he had need of it, poor fellow, came in. His team was ready for him on the hob. They all tried who should help him to it most. Then the two young Cratchits got up upon his knees and laid each child a little cheek against his face, as if they said, "Don't mind it, Father. Don't be grieved." Bob was very cheerful with them and spoke pleasantly to all the family. He looked at the work upon the table and praised the industry and speed of Mrs. Cratchit and the girls. They would be done long before Sunday, he said. Sunday? You went today then, Robert? Yes, my dear, returned Bob. I wish you could have gone. It would do you some good to see how green a place it is. But you'll see it often. I promised him I would walk there on a Sunday. Little child. He broke down all at once. He couldn't help it. If he could have helped it, he and his child would have been farther apart, perhaps, than they were. Spectre, said Scrooge, something informs me that our parting moment is at hand. I know it, but know not how. Tell me what man that was with the covered face whom we saw lying dead. The ghost of Christmas yet to come conveyed him as before, though there seemed to be no order to these later visions, save that they were in the future. Indeed, the spirits did not stay for anything, but went straight on, until besought by Scrooge to tarry for a moment. This court is where my place of business is. Let me behold what I shall be in days to come. The spirit stopped. The hand was pointing elsewhere. The building's yonder. Why do you point away? The hand underwent no change. Scrooge hastened to the window of his office and looked in. It was an office still, but not his. The furniture was not the same, and the figure in the chair was not himself. The spirit pointed on as before. He joined it once again, wondering why and whither he had gone, until the spirit led him to a dismal, wretched, ruinous churchyard. Then the spirit stood among the graves and pointed down to one. Before I draw nearer to that stone to which you point, answer me one question. Are these the shadows of things that will be, or are they the shadows of things that may be only? Still, the ghost pointed downward to the grave by which it stood. Men's courses will foreshadow certain ends to which, if persevered in, they must lead. But if the courses be departed from, the ends will change. Say it is thus with what you show me. The spirit was as immovable as ever. Scrooge crept towards it, trembling as he went, and, following the finger, read upon the stone of the neglected grave his own name, Ebenezer Scrooge. Am I the man that lay upon the bed? Oh, no, spirit. Oh, no, no, spirit. Hear me. I am not the man I once was. I will not be the man I must have been but for this intercourse. Why show me this if I am past all hope? Assure me that I may yet change these shadows that you have shown me by an altered life. For the first time, the kind hand faltered. I will honor Christmas in my heart and try to keep it all the year. I will live in the past, the present, and the future. The spirits of all three shall strive within me. I will not shut out the lessons that they teach. Oh, tell me that I may sponge away the writing on the stone. Holding up his hands in one last prayer to have his fate reversed, he saw an alteration in the phantom's hood and dress. It shrunk, collapsed, and dwindled down into a bedpost. Yes, the bedpost was his own. The bed was his own. The room was his own. Best and happiest of all, the time before him was his own to make amends in. He was checked in his transports by the churches ringing out the lustiest peals he had ever heard. Running to the window, he opened it and put out his head. No fog, no mist, no night. Clear, bright, stirring, golden day. What's today? Cried Scrooge, calling out to a boy in Sunday clothes who had perhaps loitered in to look about him. Eh? What's today, my fine fellow? What? Christmas Day. It's Christmas Day. I haven't missed it. Hello, my fine fellow. Hello. Do you know the poulterers in the next street but one, at the corner? I should hope I did. An intelligent boy, remarkable boy. Do you know that they've sold the prize turkey that was hanging there? Not the little prize turkey, the big one. What, one big as me? What a delightful boy. It's a pleasure to talk to him. Yes, my buck. It's hanging there now. Is it? Go and buy it. Oh, yes, exclaimed the boy. No, I'm in earnest. Go and buy it. Tell him to bring it here, that I may give them the directions where to take it. Come back with the poulterer's man, and I'll give you a shilling. Come back with him in less than 5 minutes, I'll give you half a crown. Boy, it was off like a shot. But at the bottom Cratchit says, she'll know who sends it. It's twice the size of Tiny Tim. Joe Miller never made such a joke as sending it to Bob's, will be. The hand in which he wrote the address was not a steady one, but write it he did somehow, and went down the stairs to open the street door, ready for the coming of the poulterer's man. Oh, it was a turkey. Would have stood up on his legs, that bird. He would have snapped them off short in a minute, like sticks of sealing wax. Scrooge dressed himself, all in his best, and at last got out into the streets. The people were by this time pouring forth, as he had seen them with the ghost of Christmas present. And walking with his hands behind him, Scrooge regarded everyone with a delighted smile. He looked so irresistibly pleasant, in a word, that 3 or 4 good-looking, good-humored fellows said, "Good morning, sir. Merry Christmas to you." And Scrooge said often afterwards, of all the blithe sounds he had ever heard, those were the blithest in his ears. He went to church, and in the afternoon turned his steps towards his nephew's house. He passed the door a dozen times before he had the courage to go up and knock, but he made a dash and did it. "Is your master at home, my dear?" said Scrooge to the girl. "Nice girl, very." "Yes, sir." "Where is he, my love?" "He's in the dining room, sir, with mistress." "He knows me," said Scrooge, with his hand already upon the dining room lock. "I'll go in here, my dear." "Fred." "Why, bless my soul," cried Fred. "Who's that?" "It's I, your Uncle Scrooge. I've come to dinner." Will you let me in, Fred? Let him in? It is a mercy. He didn't shake his arm off. Scrooge was at home in 5 minutes. Nothing could be heartier. His niece looked just the same. So did Topper when he came. So did the plump sister when she came. So did everyone when they came. Wonderful party, wonderful games, wonderful unanimity, wonderful happiness. But he was early at the office next morning. Oh, he was early there. If he could only be there first and catch Bob Cratchit coming late. Oh, it was the thing he had his heart set upon. Then he did it. The clock struck 9. No Bob. 1:15. No Bob. Bob was a full 18 minutes and a half behind his time. Scrooge sat with his door wide open that he might see him come into the tank. Bob's hat was off before he opened the door, his comforter too. He was on the stool in a jiffy, driving away with his pen as if he was trying to overtake 9 o'clock. "Hello," growled Scrooge in his accustomed voice, as near as he could feign it. "What do you mean by coming here at this time of day?" "I'm very sorry, sir. I am behind my time." "You are? Yes, I think you are. Step this way, if you please." It's only once a year, sir. It shall not be repeated. I was making rather merry yesterday, sir." "Well, I'll tell you what, my friend, I'm not going to stand for this sort of thing any longer. And therefore," Scrooge continued, leaping from his stool and giving Bob such a dig in the waistcoat that he staggered back into the tank again, "and therefore, I'm about to raise your salary." Bob trembled and got a little nearer to the ruler. He had half an idea of overpowering Scrooge and crying out to the people in the court for help and a straitjacket. "A Merry Christmas, Bob," said Scrooge with an earnestness that could not be mistaken as he clapped him on the back. "A merrier Christmas, Bob, my good fellow, than I've given you for many a year. I'll raise your salary and endeavor to assist your struggling family. And we will discuss your affairs this very afternoon over a Christmas bowl of smoking bishop, Bob. Pick up the fires and buy a second coal scuttle before you dot another I, Bob Cratchit." Scrooge was better than his word. He did it all and infinitely more. And to Tiny Tim, who did not die, he was a second father. He became as good a friend, as a good master, and as good a man as the good old city knew, or any other good old city, town, or borough in the good old world. Some people laughed to see the alteration in him, but his own heart laughed, and that was quite enough for him. It was always said of him that he knew how to keep Christmas well, if any man alive possessed the knowledge. May that be said of us and all of us. And as Tiny Tim observed, God bless us, everyone. Tonight's reading was in memory of Roxanne Campagna and my cousin Michael Cords. On behalf of Larchmont Library, Charles Dickens, and the spirit of Christmas, thank you for coming, and good night. Thank you. Right.